firmly in the era of sequels and nostalgia for Disney at the box office. For the most part, that's all they're able to get people to come and see when it comes to their family-based entertainment. Proven commodities in the forms of sequels, remakes, and franchise films. In the end, the film business is just that, a business. They're in it to make money for themselves and their investors, and so what sells is going to take precedence over what's going to be more creative or artistically satisfying. That, I guess, is what I want to talk a little bit about today. There's been some rumblings about some potential sequels that are in the works that I'd like to address, talking about whether I think they're going to be a good idea, and then what the story ideas could be. For reference, the two franchises we're going to be talking about today that have had sequels either confirmed or heavily rumoured are the live-action Lilo and Stitch franchise and Ratatouille. We'll start with Lilo and Stitch, the live-action remake, not the animation. I think it's safe to say that the success of the Lilo and Stitch live-action remake has ensured that Disney's going to keep milking their animated IP for all it's worth, and keep pushing to make them into live-action movies. They've had a shaky couple of years after the glory that was the back-to-back billions of The Lion King and Aladdin, but of course, you cannot underestimate the power of pure, refined nostalgia that today's audience flocks to like flies on honey. It's like catnip for these people. Audiences go nuts for it, and so whilst the original Lilo and Stitch only grossed a more modest $271 million, the remake, juiced up with the power of over 23 years of nostalgia, is creeping ever closer to $1 billion. It's currently sitting at $972 million overall, which means that it's currently the second highest grossing film of the year, and could be the first American movie to cross the $1 billion mark in 2025. Of course, with success like that is going to come the discussion of sequels and continuations. A franchise of its very own that they can continue to milk. Before the release of the movie, everybody was a bit more guarded about the potential for a sequel. And that makes sense, as obviously before the movie was released, they weren't sure whether it was going to be a smash hit or not, or whether it would be a middling success. I don't think they ever thought it was going to be a flop, but then again, you never know. Regardless, they weren't going to publicly commit to anything without the data at hand, because then if it failed, they'd either have to publicly cancel or just quietly shuffle it off to the side, and either way, it would be a bit embarrassing and just bad business. When they saw it was starting to blow up, they obviously would have been ready with that green light until just a week or two ago they announced that a sequel is officially in development. What that means though is anybody's guess. It could mean that they're only now starting to workshop ideas for the film. It could mean they already had ideas ready to go and might be starting to look around to write a script. Truly, who knows? We'll get the film eventually, that's all I know. Maybe in 2027 or 2028. However, I do have to say that whilst it clearly is the correct decision for the studio to make for financial reasons, I don't think that I personally have all that much excitement or appetite for it. Don't get me wrong. I wasn't one of those people that went into the Lilo and Stitch remake with the intention of hating everything I saw. Far from it. I was actually massively hyped for the film for the majority of its pre-release run. I thought the trailers were a lot of fun and that it was going to be a hell of a good time. Even having watched the film, there was a lot that I enjoyed, and I reckon that overall it's still a very good film that's worth the watch. But that being said, there was a bunch of creative decisions that were made that I well and truly think damaged the film's potential for sequels. The first of these is pretty much a 2-for-1 special. They mangled the whole villain setup during the course of the film, and the second act of the movie. For starters, Captain Gantu right from the get-go is not a character in the film. Part of me thought that whilst he wasn't in that early section of the movie where Stitch busts himself out of jail and steals the spaceship, that maybe he would be revealed later on. And I kept on hoping and hoping that this would be the case, but in the end it wasn't to be and he never showed up. Apparently they wanted the film to feel more grounded and so they didn't include him, which... who the hell wants to have a grounded sci-fi adventure? Just be honest, you didn't want to spend the money on animating him. Admit it and we won't argue. Thus, we lost one of the best characters from the original movie, and the chance to recreate one of the funniest shots of all time, where after they've crashed the spaceship during the rescue of Lilo, Gantu's just sitting sadly on the side of the ship, completely defeated. On top of that, he was such a funny driving force in the show, which really does have a lot of potential as a sequel factory with all the different experiments. Then comes the double whammy. By not including Gantu, it means the final act of the film would have no antagonist. They needed somebody who could kidnap Lilo or Stitch and lead them into the spaceship chase sequence. Thus, Jumba, who had a redemption arc in the original movie, is instead pivoted to fill that role. Not gonna lie, but I absolutely hated this twist with a fiery passion, and it kind of ruins the climax of the movie. It means that Jumba isn't part of the new Ohana at the end. He isn't there to rebuild the house, not that it really matters, because does Lilo even live in that house by the end? Or didn't she move in with that old lady whilst Nani goes off to college? That was pretty lame as well, to tell you the truth. But without Jumba, there's no space house, no hover car. Oh, what are we even doing here? Thus, it does have me question the pathway you'd take for any sort of sequel that's going to take place. How do you fix things up? What direction do you go in? The reality is that if you continue down this pathway, then I think it's going to be very, very unsatisfying. It doubles down on creative decisions that were poorly thought out or motivated by not wanting to take financial risks, which ended up harming the overall narrative of the film. So why would you keep walking that very same path? It doesn't make any sense to me to do this. Thus, how do you fix it? How do you set the story of the sequel up for the best success? First, they gotta bring back Jumba, but not as a villain. You gotta cram his redemption arc in there somewhere. The reality is that I think the best concepts for sequels are going to involve the existence of more experiments for Stitch to fight and bond with. Plus, I think the idea of having even more cutesy little characters is just too much for Disney to pass by. Think of the merch they could sell! And for more experiments, you need to have Jumba in there. Maybe he doesn't get sentenced to a longer stretch, or maybe he comes back to make things right. Maybe he eventually gets exiled to Earth or breaks out at some point. Then bring him back and get him a redemption arc, pronto! Although maybe it's for the best he's gone. Without that glorious accent, is he even Jumba anymore? Next up, they gotta bring in Gantu as well. Probably not as an agent of the United Galactic Federation this time, but maybe as a minion of Dr. Hamsterveal, because, let's be real, you gotta bring in Hamsterveal if you're doing a sequel. Have him be the long-suffering goon of Hamsterveal who in turn used to work with Jumba and who wants all the experiments for himself. Maybe they even just want Stitch, who was supposed to be the perfect warrior. Maybe Hamsterveal can bring a couple of experiments with him that he salvaged that Stitch can battle and then befriend. Also, you gotta bring in the guy that makes the sandwiches because he's just too funny. There. I have no idea how you cram all of that into a script and how to make it work, but I think it's very clear that you need to have Jumba, but as a protagonist/mentor type figure. You need to have more experiments turning up, and you gotta bring back Gantu. The dude is so iconic that it would be an absolute crime not to include him. Okay, so that's Lilo and Stitch. I'm apprehensive about a sequel because I'm worried they might not go in the direction I think they should, but it's a wait and see type of thing. However, there's yet another franchise that's also heavily rumored to be getting a continuation decades after the first installment. That is Pixar's Ratatouille. I'll be honest, of all the Pixar films that could be getting a sequel, Ratatouille is not the one I expected. Not because it's a bad film or didn't do well for itself, but because previously there just seemed to be no appetite for it from the studio or really the fans. There were always rumblings about another Toy Story or a Finding Nemo sequel, or just a huge fan demand for a follow-up to The Incredibles. These were the things that people were ravenous for. I'm not saying that people didn't care about the film or that Ratatouille is unpopular, but I just don't think it had that much momentum behind it 20 years after its release. That being said though, I can see why they might want to roll the dice on it and make a sequel film for Ratatouille. The reality is that the first film did very well for itself. When it came out back in 2005, it grossed $623 million off a budget of $150 million, not too shabby. Then you can take into account that Brad Bird's other main Pixar franchise, The Incredibles, grossed $631 million in its own first installment, and when the time came for them to release the sequel, Incredibles 2 ended up grossing a whopping $1.2 billion. Then you add that onto the fact that Pixar's really struggling to make a dent at the box office with their original content, and it seems like a no-brainer. I mean, since coming back to cinemas post-COVID, there's been Lightyear, which failed. There's been Elemental, which was only saved by the fact that it got good reviews, which led it to make a comeback at the North American box office, whilst also enjoying a lot of popularity internationally in places like South Korea, who resonated with the message of the film. Then Inside Out 2 came out, and what do you know, the sequel did huge business, $1.6 billion. Meanwhile, Elio just now, despite being a really good film, once again failed to make an impact at the box office. It's going to be a bomb. Pixar knows that it needs proven franchises to shift tickets in this day and age, and so the upcoming slate of movies includes the likes of Toy Story 5, The Incredibles 3, Coco 2. They smell the money, and so it makes a lot of sense in hindsight that they'd trot out Ratatouille once more. As for what it would be about, who really knows? To be honest, I think that's the beauty of that particular IP for any future creative team. The concept is simply a rat who can cook. That is all it is, and I think it's such a broad topic and so you can push it in any way you choose. Is their restaurant going out of business and they need to take risks to save it? Maybe they enter into a culinary competition or they're writing a cookbook, whatever you want to do. As long as it involves food and rats cooking it, they're going to be fine. I know some people are probably salty and ranting and raving about original IP, but what are Pixar meant to do? Just make movies that will always lose money? I like sequels. Inside Out 2 was great, and so if they go forward with this, like they're going forward with a bunch of other sequel projects, then I reckon it has a good chance to be a really great movie. There's one final thing I wanted to talk about before we finish up, and that is a persistent rumor that Walt Disney Animated Studios is going to pivot back to a more traditional animated style. I think all of this comes from the news that Ron Clements is back at the studio in an advisory role, and he's a big traditionally animated guy. A part of my nostalgia says that this would be so awesome, but I don't know, I just don't see it. The reality is that the Disney Rebirth era is their most successful era ever in terms of finances. By far. They were making big money and cracking the $1 billion mark multiple times. On top of that, the most recent time that we've seen them go back to the well and use that hybrid style in Wish, the film did terribly. And I think a big part of that is because the film kind of looked bad in the trailers. As in, visually bad. On top of that, Disney's biggest success stories, the likes of Zootopia and Frozen, the big $1 billion franchises they've been pushing forward with, they all use the CG style. So why go back? Maybe they'll do some experimental films to see if there's an appetite for it, but I just don't see a full pivot ever happening. They will go in the direction of the money. And so yeah, I think people need to get off their high horses about sequels. Either you put your money where your mouth is and you go and see original content, or you stop crying. In the end, whether it's for sequels, remakes, or even animation style, the studio is going to go in the direction of the money, and as long as the film's good, I see no reason to care about that. And so with all that being said, these have been my opinions, and now that I hear yours. What do you think of a potential Lilo and Stitch 2 and Ratatouille 2? Are you excited for those potential films? Maybe not. I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.